Hi everyone. Today I would like to talk about what a distorted gospel is. In Galatians 1, verse 6 and 7, it says, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. Now, this is the NASB. The King James says pervert. First of all, this is talking about believers. The distorted gospel does not refer here to a false gospel that is preached to unbelievers. Rather, it is a false version of the gospel that is being preached to believers. But what exactly is a distorted gospel? It is helpful to have a look at the Greek and at the original meaning of the word. It is metastrepho and means to turn around. Except for our text from Galatians here, there are only 2 other verses in the New Testament where it is used, and those are rather interesting. One is in Acts 2:20. The sun will be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come. The other in James 4:9. Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy to gloom. These are examples of how it can also be translated, namely, to turn one thing into another. As we see in those verses, it is actually a turning of one thing into its opposite, sun to darkness, laughter to mourning, joy to gloom. So, to distort or pervert the gospel means to turn it into its very opposite. What we need first is the definition of gospel in order to understand what those who are trying to pervert it are turning it into. Gospel comes from the Greek euangelion and means glad tidings or good news. What exactly is the good news? Of course, it centers around the person of Christ, the Son of God who became man. Let's see what his first message was when he began his public ministry. He read from the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue of Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. When Jesus said, Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, he did not yet speak of his death and resurrection, which became the center of the gospel afterwards. What would be accomplished through it was still a secret at that point. Since Jesus was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, it contained the kingdom promise. So, while it is not actually a message for the church, which only came into existence after his death and resurrection, we can still derive the nature of Jesus' ministry at his first coming from it. It has a second layer, and is also true for us, the church. It is a message of deliverance, of release to the captives. It talks about setting free the oppressed. Neither are the poor to whom this message is addressed to be understood literally as only economically poor people, nor the blind whose eyes will be opened only literally blind people, nor did Jesus go to the prisons and try to get imprisoned people free. While it is true that Jesus actually did heal physically blind people, this is really talking about the spiritually blind. Jesus makes that application himself, talking to the Pharisees. Also, he didn't come to feed the poor, although on one occasion he did provide food miraculously, but he applied this to the recognition of being in need of salvation, of realizing one's spiritual poverty. So, obviously, by addressing the captives and oppressed, Jesus is referring to those who are held captive figuratively by an invisible principle. He also proclaimed the favorable year of the Lord, the Jubilee, the 50th sabbatical year, where land was to be returned to the original owners and those who had to sell themselves as slaves could return to their families. No sowing or reaping was to take place during that year. God's promise was for the crops of the 6th year to be sufficient to live on during the sabbatical year and the Jubilee. So, to sum it up, the good news Jesus proclaimed was remission of debt, giving back what was taken away, being set free from working as a slave, resting from one's work, and provision from the Lord himself. While all this began to be fulfilled during Jesus' earthly ministry, it was at the same time a foreshadowing of what would be accomplished by his death and resurrection. Remission of debt has of course been accomplished by his atonement on the cross. We are no longer slaves, but son and heirs, fellow heirs with Christ, as Romans 8 says. Chapter 6, verse 7 says that we have been freed from sin because we were crucified with Christ, and chapter 7, verse 6 states, "But now we have been released from the law, having died to that by which we were bound." In Hebrews 4, sorry, I got interrupted. So, in Hebrews 4, verses 9 through 11, it says, "There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that has entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief." Here we already see that it is possible to forfeit that which Christ has wrought. We are asked to actively turn towards what he has accomplished, namely, for us to be able to rest from our works, and we are told that the reason that some do not enter is unbelief. It's interesting here that it says entering into his rest means resting from one's own works. So, whatever is being done from a position of resting will not be regarded as own works by the believer anymore. It'll just be a natural flow of Christ through him, and whatever he does, he enjoys doing. It will not feel like a work to him. Nobody has to tell him, "You got to do some works." Nor does he himself wake up with this burden each day, "I got to do all those works." Neither will he be busy pondering about how he can drive it home to others that they really got to do works now. So, let's start right there, the point of resting from one's work, and have a look at how the gospel can be turned into its opposite. If during the Sabbath year you had admonished an Israelite to work in the field, you would have directly gone against God's will. Even if you had packaged the admonition nicely by appealing to someone's gratitude, like, "Aren't you glad you are free now and were able to come home? Now that your father provides everything for you, don't you think the least you can do is show your gratitude and help with the work?" Now think about the prodigal son. Imagine someone had said to him after he had returned to the father's house, "Now that you've taken a bath and filled your stomach, here's the plow and the oxen. You know where the field is, right? I'm sure you will want to serve him now out of a thankful heart. He's provided everything for you to be able to do so, the tools and strength through good food." Now, doesn't that kind of sound right? As a matter of fact, that was exactly the mindset of the son when he returned home. He was planning on taking the place of a servant in his father's house, because he figured that he had forfeited his right to be a son. The father, however, only addresses him as a son and treats him accordingly. There is not the slightest hint of him intending to send him to the field to work with his servants. All he does is make him see that everything has already been provided for by him, just like in the Sabbath year. All the son has to do is sit at the table and enjoy the feast. Jesus came to set the captives free. By offering to work for the Father as for a new master, we show that we haven't understood the gospel and the position it has secured us. Those who try to make you feel guilty or indebted, telling you that you must work now, often frame this in a very religious way. They say, "He did everything for you. Now you owe him your whole life." Complete surrender of every area of your life is the least you can do and should do. But consider what Galatians 5 verse 1 says. "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore keep standing firm, and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." Watch out. There are those who pervert the gospel and try to bring you under a yoke again. The devil turns everything God says upside down, but he does it in a subtle way. We see that in the way he seduced Eve. The first thing he said was the exact opposite of what God had said. "You surely shall not die." Although God had said they would die the moment they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But he didn't leave it at that. Now comes the seduction. "For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So, first comes the perversion of God's message, then the seduction. Here again, by the way, the distortion has to do with sowing doubt regarding his provision. They had everything they needed. They could eat from all the trees in the garden, but the serpent succeeded in convincing Eve that God was withholding something from her, something good she needed to be really blessed. He also told her she would be like God. That appealed to her ego. There are parallels to that today. Some, like John MacArthur, for example, say we don't have a sin nature anymore, only the new nature, and can therefore now, quote-unquote, keep God's commandments, disregarding the fact that the Christian walk does not have anything to do with commandment keeping. They say, since you have a new heart now, you are now enabled to keep them, and if you don't succeed in doing that, this shows that you were never saved in the first place. Why did God judge the Israelites and bring them into captivity in Babylon? Because they hadn't worked enough? No, the exact opposite. They had worked when they shouldn't have done it, but should have rested in the Sabbath year. By doing so, they gave proof that they didn't believe that God would be able to provide for them in the seventh year. They wanted to help him out. Think about those that say, "Lord, Lord," in Matthew 7. They presented all those works and were convinced they would get a triumphant entry into heaven. The opposite was the case. No entry whatsoever. Jesus didn't even know them. They hadn't actually understood the gospel. They turned it into its opposite. They were in unbelief. Now, what is the recommendation the Bible gives us so that we won't fall prey to a perverted gospel? In Colossians 1, it says, "And you, who once were alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled in the body of his flesh through death, to present you holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight. If indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard." Note here that the wicked works done as an unbeliever are not contrasted to good works that are now being done as a believer. Instead, what is it that makes one blameless and above reproach in God's sight? As little sin as possible, as many good works as possible? No, it's the faith, being grounded and steadfast, and not being moved away. From what? From the hope of the gospel. So, not being blameless is equated to letting oneself be moved away to a distorted gospel, one that adds to the good news and brings one back into bondage and puts the focus back on man and his works instead of on Jesus and his work. This is the goal of those who promote it, namely, to bring the believer back into bondage. We see that in Galatians 2, where it says, "But it was because of the false brethren, secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out the liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. So, we are called to defend our liberty by all means, to dig in our heels, so to speak, in a positive sense, and not to yield to attempts to bring us back into bondage, even if those attempts sound very humble and spiritual. We got to see through those and see them for what they really are, namely, attempts to appeal to our ego, telling us, you can do this now, keep his commandments, serve him. Heeding a distorted gospel will result in exhaustion, condemnation, or self-righteousness. What it never leads to is rest. And this is what Jesus explicitly said he had come to bring us. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And in Hebrews 4:10, it says, for the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. So let us not be moved away from the hope of the gospel, and not be deceived by the craftiness of the serpent, and not be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ, as 2 Corinthians 11:3 says. I hope this was helpful, and I wish you a blessed day.